Sheela Patel is the founder director of the Society for the Promotion of Area Resource Center, SPARC, an NGO based in Mumbai that aims to mobilize large numbers of the urban poor and to support and strengthen their organizations to enable them to become an important part of the city system, and is widely recognized for bringing urgent attention to the issues of urban poverty, housing, and infrastructure onto the radar of government, bilateral and international agencies, foundations, and other organizations. Sheila is the founder amongst many of the slum dwellers of the network, the Slum Dwellers International, a transnational social movement of the urban poor in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Since 2022, Sheila has been spearheading the campaign for Roof Over Our Heads, that is now part of the UN Race to Resilience campaign. She has been awarded the Padma Shri by the Government of India in 2011 and was a commissioner of the Commission for Adaptation to Climate Change between 2018 and 20, and is currently a trustee of the International Institute of Environment and Development in London, Global Ambassador for Race to Zero and Race to Resilience, member of the Club of Rome, and a board member of Climate KIC. She was awarded the 2023 Lawrence C. Nussdorf Urban Leadership Prize by PEN IUR and has been named in the Forbes 50 under 50 list in 2025. Thank you, Sheila, once again for your time. It would be a great pleasure to hear from you about your experience. Over to you.
Thank you, Binti. The last one is 50 over 50, not under 50. Because I'm going to talk about 50 years of my work, so it can't be under 50.
I'm sorry
so
about
thank you very much. No, that's okay. Can we start with the slides, Indu?
Just a minute. It stopped sharing suddenly.
Okay, so until the slides come on, let me just say that this is a very important and a critical topic for us to discuss at this juncture of time, when there are so many paradigm shifts and so many things that we took for granted, so many ways of doing things that we thought were the right way. Political alignments, notions of who we stand for, how we do research, what do we consider good quality action, how do we deal with global crisis at local context, and so on. And so this particular discussion about dealing with complexities that activists, academia, private sector, governments, northern and southern institutional arrangements have to deal with are very, very important as we stand on these crossroads. Do we continue to do things that we are comfortable with, that sit nicely in our framework and are part of our routine? Or do we have the courage and the tenacity and the perseverance to explore new ways of doing things, new ways of analyzing challenges, new co-production of solutions versus just taking something that somebody else has done and saying that if so much research has gone into it, it must be good. And so my topic for the day is called co-production of transformation. And I have been very fortunate that unlike many others who may or may not have been compelled to just take whatever is being done in the development sphere form the basis of what they did, I had an amazing opportunity to explore whatever challenges I was facing in ways that at that time I had no idea would lead me to an amazing new paradigm of how you engage a strategy, identify problems, test solutions, scale them, deal with failures, and still rise up to make other things happen. Anyway, so let me just start because otherwise we lose time, and the time I enjoy the most is the question answers.
Yes, yes.
So,
Please.
my entire career, my entire body of work has been to address the challenges of informality in cities. And I call it one of the most wicked problems with very complex challenges for the 20th and the 21st century. And it has a long history of why it hasn't changed over the last several centuries. That we produce uh, habitats, we produce cities, we produce resources, we do all these things not for any other reason, but to actually support the production and the exchange of goods and services of elites, with everybody else helping them. And that's the formation of how cities came to be. They were places that were traded. Please go to the next slide. And therefore, you had a situation where there was a space that was protected by the king or the local ruler or whoever owned that land, where people came to trade. They paid a price for trading, and they brought with them people who looked after the goods and provided the services and did all those who lived outside that area. And whenever those areas needed to be expanded or made more permanent, these communities that serviced those areas just moved further and further. And if you take the modern city in the global south, we see the same phenomena. You have the business centers, the residential areas, the commercial areas, which are part of the formal economy around the city center. And then you have huts and settlements that are informal beyond that. And we keep having evictions of these households every time that there is a need to expand the space for the formal city to live. What this has done is that it provides for a dependable but insecure workforce that is available to the city because that's the only way through this interdependency that they survive. And while there's a lot of rhetoric in our general development, can you go to the next slide? There's a lot of attempt to understand that there should be something that should address this. All of us who work in development at universities, in NGOs, in governments, in UN agencies, and so on, uh, we all are seemingly working towards improving the quality of life, improving the legal frameworks to give some land security, some entitlements to communities that live like this. But the reality is very starkly different. What we find, which is the situation as it stands now with the SDGs, it's going to get worse since Mr. Trump is doing a lot of things to stop aid. Uh, in November of last year, at the COP, it was announced that only 13.5 was what was the achievements of the SDGs, and we are already in 2025. So it basically shows that while the rhetoric is terrific, the investments, the work undertaken, the the frameworks on the basis of which all this is done are very clearly flawed. And they are not able to address any of these challenges. And therefore, it's an interesting question to say what should the role of research and development be? How should practical action on the ground explore solutions when in reality, while there are pockets of excellence, there aren't really amazing transitions and transformations. And so many of my many of my friends who are economists tell me that, well, people's incomes have increased. Well, so has inflation, so has the cost of living. And so the whole issue is the SDGs haven't got enough money, haven't got enough strategies, haven't got a development framework that works. And the same is happening with climate. With climate, the challenge is even worse because where 100 billion was supposed to come to assist climate change, not even 10% of it has come, and not most of it has been used. And only 1% of what has been allocated comes to adaptation. Now, why is adaptation important? It's important because, just continue to the next slide. Uh, it's and the next one after that. So what we realize is that some of us actually had the privilege of not having a very strong framework on the basis of which we did what we did. And my journey is one of them, where as a person who had a tertiary education and wanted to work on issues of poverty, we began to explore these things and we found that nothing that was there in theory building actually works for the poor. And therefore, learning to and exploring and experimenting with peers began to provide new forms of partnership through which those of us who were supposed to help those who were disenfranchised got together and began to explore this process. And it's only when you look back on the several decades of work that you see that we accidentally found that those who were very poor were not ready to accept what you said because you are an educated professional and a do-gooder, but they needed evidence to show that the investment that was supposed to be made had a positive impact on the quality of their lives. And if we were looking at anything for scale, we had to co-produce the solution with communities, and we had to look at ways by which we did this in a manner that demonstrated by its evidence that it worked for them. Can we go to the next slide, please? Oh. So my first 10 years of work from 74 to 83, 84 were at a community center in which, in a very, very working class district near the port in Mumbai, and it was a center which has the amazing claim to fame in India as being the place where the first school of social work, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, was born, and professional education for social workers began. And what I now my screen has died. Okay. And so it was a place that historically had 5 different communities living at a at this amazing space, and there were a lot of riots. And the initial work of this organization was to deal with riots. By the time I came to work, it had become a service center which provided services to people in the neighborhood. And what we realized is that we were supposed to be providing what poor households needed, but we provided them what our programs that got funded paid us to do. And to cut a very long story short, for about 6 of those years, I was made in charge of the program because our director wasn't there. And it gave me the opportunity to sit with communities, talk to women, and then decide what we could do with the resources that we had, what timings we would have the services for, and how would the community, women, and the people who lived in who worked in this place collectively decided to do things. And it did three things. It changed our sense of who we were. We were facilitators rather than managers of a program. Because people got what they needed, every time they spoke to others, more people came. And so a small pool of resources served a very large number of people. And when very large number of people came into the process, it transformed the way in which the environment dealt with you. So I'll give you a very interesting example. That was the time when a lot of uh, uh, brown sugar and uncut heroin passed through Bombay in the trade. And many of the young people were asked to were asked to trade in it, and many of them got addicted. And then they would steal from the neighborhood and from the slums. And these community women, having identified this problem, actually worked with the police and the local addiction center to get all these young people supported to get out of their addictions in a very different way than what the police were doing before, which was just taking them and dumping them into jail. And so what we did was that we did a whole lot of things. I'm not going to go there, but that was the beginning of liberating myself from doing something because that was the way social work was done or uh, dealing with the poor was done. And it was in 1984 that my colleagues and I registered SPARC. I won't go into the detail of why we started SPARC or anything, but before we knew it, we were three organizations that got together. One was a much older local people's organization called the National Slum Dwellers Federation. There was us in SPARC that was formed in 84. And in 1986, we formed an organization of women's collectives called Mahila Milan, where not only the male leaders in the neighborhoods got together to form National Slum Dwellers Federation, but women had two identities, one as members of NSDF, but also of women's collectives. And it was the women's collectives that did the main work on the ground. What we realized is that we formed a symbiotic relationship of trust. We ensured women's central participation. We started our work with the poorest communities in the poorest neighborhoods because we believed that if something worked for them, even if it took a very long time to do, that it would work for everybody else. And therefore, not only did it take whatever resources we had and stretch them, but it also made people aware of their entitlements and what they could demand from government. And so when you have a large volume of people, we had 150, 250,000 households in Mumbai who were members. Very difficult for their logic of how change can come to them if the state did this or that for them. And it made a big difference. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this is how we looked. till about 3 years or 2 years ago, we used to work in about 70 cities in 9 states. And NSDF was in all those locations. We as SPARC were based only in Mumbai. And then we had Mahila Milan in all those cities. And therefore, the, the concept by which we worked, please go to the next slide. I keep forgetting here. So that's what it looks like, our formation. And then go to the next slide. And then we developed a concept called precedent setting. By that we mean that we do something that is not it's not like somebody hasn't done it, but we always develop solutions in which communities were quite centrally involved. So for instance, everybody collects data. But the first piece of research which we did was this document called We the Invisible, where we demonstrated that you could do a census of pavement dwellers on the streets of Mumbai and present to the city and to the municipality and the government what was the situation of those who lived on the pavements. And we brought out some very startling ideas. First, that 50% of the people living on the pavements were from Maharashtra and 50% were from outside. Two, that 90% of the people were landless in their rural areas. And third, that people chose to live in the city very near to where they worked because it took 3 people to produce a single minimum wage for the family. Therefore, they couldn't afford public transport. Now, these are not amazing facts now, but that time, that you could do a census, that it was done by communities, and that it produced these startling impacts was a precedent. It was a new way of doing things. And what it did was it liberated us from believing that research is a very complicated situation and that only very smart people in universities and research organizations can do that. And we said, no, everybody can do research. And there's a very good article written by Professor Appadurai saying the right to research, that it is everybody's right to do research. And the challenge is, how do you identify issues? How do you produce the information? And for whom is that information accountable to? Go to the next one. So the next slide is that we began to look at how do we create a movement and how can we provide communities with tools that will be able to expand the number of people who use a particular strategy or a particular way of engaging the city or accessing resources. It was to our luck that in 1987, it was the year of shelter for the homeless. And we met many activists from Asia who wanted to set up an Asian organization to fight evictions called the Asian Coalition of Housing Rights. It is still an organization and it had about, you can go on their website at some point, but it's an organization in which NGOs and activists and communities working in Asia got together to learn from each other. And this was very important for us at that time because we always had people from the UN, people from the World Bank, people from the Asian Development Bank teaching us development when we knew that those processes didn't work for the community. And so what we did was that we became a member of that. And very quickly, the manner in which Mahila Milan did savings groups, the way in which we did our surveys, the way we developed different instruments, all of these we shared with everybody else, and we learned many things from them. as a result of which it wasn't just the professionals meeting each other, it was also the communities. And while this is not there in my presentation, what is important is that a week or two ago, we lost a very, very important person of our movement called Father Jorge Anzorina. He was a Argentinian Jesuit priest who lived his entire life in Japan and taught architecture in the Sophia University in Tokyo. But he taught there 6 months of the year, and the other 6 months of the year, he traveled to all the continents to see what was being done in different places. And we all got to know more and more people working in different places, doing different things. And we developed a tradition that it wasn't just professionals who traveled, but also community leaders. And that was his gift to us. In 1992, uh, Nelson Mandela, for those of you who were there young at that time, uh, he was released from, no, in 1989, he was released from prison. And then there were elections, and he was the president. And during that presidency, about 50 or 60 of housing activists from all over the world were invited to meet 80 township leaders from South African different states. And when we explained what we did as ACHR, they invited us to set up programs like that. And out of that, in 1992 came the uh, Slum Dwellers International. Can you go to the next one? So the the chart goes like this: that everything begins in a settlement, but it aggregates at city, province, country, and global level. And this was a way for us to demonstrate that there is a deep connection between the choices that are available at a neighborhood and the global discourse about it, and that most local people can never challenge what is being discussed globally in finance, in design, in program development, in production of assistance. And we believed that our ability to prepare ourselves and our community networks to be able to make representations at all these places would change the way in which we were perceived, the solutions which we thought about were accepted, and what they were looked at. So this part demonstrates the aspect of developing innovative institutional arrangements that responds to a changing world, but maintaining voice and choice for those who actually have to face these challenges. Let's go to the next slide. So in India, we had many breakthroughs. Uh, Interestingly, in the first 15 or 20 years of our work as SPARC, we were constantly fighting with professional planners, engineers, architects, because everything we wanted to do was not acceptable in the sort of what you would call the good practice manuals of these organizations and their networks. So we would fight with architects who came and said, "Oh, you need big windows. The house has very small windows," and the women would give them a fantastic rationale for why that was so. But I won't go into that. Anyway, so the most important thing was that because of the research we did, the documentation we did, the data that we did, from the 1990s, we began to be involved in policy making in looking at how slums could be redeveloped. And the picture here is the first time that we actually co-produced a design for housing for slum dwellers based on their design, uh, and which demonstrated that you don't need a formal builder all the time or a developer who comes from outside and builds houses. People can do it themselves. And the design and the manner in which we did were able to change the regulatory frameworks of what the design brief was. Go to the next one. Around 1995 itself, the city of Mumbai's railway uh, system was breaking down completely. And so we not only got involved in designing resettlement, but we got the World Bank to change and our government to change the rules of the fact that the people who lived along the railway track did their own censuses, they formed societies, they defined where they wanted to stay, and they moved. And it's one of the few projects in which the project finished before time. It gave everybody a house and it produced the architecture for all infrastructure projects on the basis of a rationale that when you need to clear an area, you need to give people alternate housing. You need to give it to them in places that work for them and that they have to be involved in that process. And if you do that, the project gets completed on time and it works. It sounds so simple as we said it. It took us 2 or 3 years of negotiation and then project itself took almost 8 to 10 years. But 18,000 households were relocated. And now all the projects on relocation, on infrastructure are dealt with like that. I think that this was also something which became an important precedent for other railways. So in the Philippines, in Kenya, in other places where railways require to move people away from the track, both for their own safety and for the trains to go faster, looked at these models and then adapted them to their own process. Next slide. So I'm going to go through these very fast because I prefer to have a conversation with you. So the next next slide is similarly on toilets. So we developed a campaign where we said that the toilets, wherever there's no water supply, there's no drainage and sewage, there should be toilets. And then we did this study, which is now very well known, where uh, you can read it, that basically uh, most of the toilets didn't end up working. There were reasons why they didn't work. And we have a publication called Toilet Talk, which is available on the net. So you can look at that as well. Because of all these projects that we did, we set up a construction company. And it was only we started working with pavement dwellers in 1986. It was 2005 by the time we got a policy to actually include pavement dwellers in the infrastructure projects as part of the improvement of traffic. And these women that you see here, you have to move to the next slide, please. Sorry. So these women that you see down were our original representatives of the households in Baikala where we started our work. The thing on the top is their houses. The average size was 30 to 45 feet, square feet, and the taller houses are like 12 feet with a mezzanine. So we designed these houses with mezzanines, but much bigger, and it was designed by the women themselves. And we set up a construction company so that we could partner with these associations and build the houses. Go to the next one, please. So we continue to do this not only in India, but in many other places. Uh, I went it. Huh? So what we also found was that in 2005, at a time when I used to equate climate with environmentalists who always fought with slum dwellers, a very dear friend of mine and a very well-known scholar, David Satterthwaite, kept telling us that very soon you'll have to deal with extreme weather caused by climate change, and poor people are going to get affected by it, and you should do something. And it was around that time that Mary Robinson was asked to set up a group to address the challenge of climate and social justice. And my journey of exploring climate began at that time. And it was a very hard and a difficult 10 years to look at how do you blend climate and development. And they should actually work together. But from the UN down, there's always this thing that the SDGs are for development, and there's a bit of climate there. And then you have the UNFCCC, which deals with climate, and there's some development there. So it's something that all of us have to deal with and manage some way or the other. And it was in 2020 that, as part of the Commission for Adaptation to Climate Change, that my knowledge and my understanding of the different elements of climate change and how mitigation and adaptation and resilience and disaster are different dimensions of the same challenge. And it further reinforced to me that adaptation and the production of resilience has to be a universal, global campaign that must reach every single human being, because all of us make choices, and most of our choices do not work for climate, either neutralizing bad things or enhancing some things. And therefore, development of the 19th, 20th century are increasingly dysfunctional for what we need to do in this century. And so, in some ways, that became a way for me to work in climate. Can we go to the next one? And while we were in this year and a half of a very sort of important, seemingly important commission, where Ban Ki-moon and Kristalina Georgieva and all these people were, and ministers and others were there. I was there representing the issues of informality. And I don't think, except me and one other person, anybody actually did much about it. They talked about cities, they talked about city systems, they talked about transport, but nobody acknowledged that 40 to 60% of all our cities in the global south have people living informally. And that was a really traumatic situation, and one which I think all of us who are dealing with cities and with climate change have to grapple. Because if there are an estimated billion people living informally today, given our inability to do anything with rising temperatures, this is going to double. And our cities cannot cope with anything now, so how are they going to cope with what's going to happen in the future? Please go to the next one. And so a lot of our own work, and I see of a lot of other people, has begun to look at these different things. And only last year, the Secretary General of the UN announced that heat is one of the biggest killers, and extreme heat is now affecting us. This chart is terrifying. If you look at the red to the orange, terrifying. And each year, this is going to increase and it's going to change weather patterns. And the impact of it on everybody is terrible. But what it's going to do with the poor, with those who live informally, is going to be devastating. Go to the next one. Next slide. So, in what we call part two of our work, during COVID, we were all stuck in our homes. We all discovered this amazing net-based conversation. And the experiences of communities and the experiences of what people needed to do led us to uh, have a network of all the women from all the countries of SDI and are in India to start talking to each other and saying, what can we learn from each other? Go to the next slide. It led us to a campaign that we called What Women Want. And out of the things that they said they wanted, they chose 5 things that were priorities. The first one was called Roof Over Our Heads. It dealt with the reality that their homes, which they built for survival purposes, was not adequately equipped for extreme wind, rain, and heat. The second one was that COVID and the challenges of food supply demonstrated that most poor people were eating white carbs. And that was leading to chronic diseases like uh, diabetes and blood pressure and uh, people getting strokes and organ function failures. And we started a campaign called Greens in My Meal, saying at least 35% of all the volume of food you eat should be green, and people can grow these things. Cities can help people grow. And many cities started doing that. The third thing was that women took care of everybody but not their own health. Fourth one was, which was really terrible during the COVID times, was that while all cities worked on transport, there was very little connectivity with that transport network and the places where poor people live. So they paid inordinate and really very high percentage of their wages for transport, and said, how can we document the link between adequate access to transport around the city and wages? And then the fifth one was that women were fed up of being victims. They didn't want to constantly be like these supplicants who were looking for something or the other. And so we said, we want to be warriors. We are the first people on the scene. Work with us, teach us how to do these things, and work with us. So these were the 5 things. And we created a leadership channel from local to global to train women to be able to talk at different levels. Can we go to the next one? And so one of the things that we are doing now is we have a global campaign called Roof Over Our Heads, where we go back to the basics of how people build houses, with the shocking news that 92% of households design, construct, and finance their own homes, and that extreme weather adds the burden of vulnerability and moves the climate space center into how change must happen. Next. So while we do what we do, What we are doing in RU is doing a campaign which has 100 learning labs in which young professionals from universities, social science, uh, social sciences, engineering, architecture, planning, medicine, all these people work with communities to look at within the resources that they have, with the materials that they can obtain, with construction systems, how can we change these things and modify them to help people either incrementally or completely weatherproof their homes in the resources that they have by bringing new techniques, new materials, and new systems of construction. And each year we report what we do in RU at the COP. So we have two publications. Indu, if you can put the links to that for everybody. And we invite Mary Robinson, the different champions of the COP and others to spend an hour with us as we report to them what we do. And Binti, if you feel that there are people who'd like to have a session on RU, we'd be happy to do that.
Sure.
But our entire process, and I'll end here because I'd like to hear you talk instead of you talking on and on. What we are trying to do is we are trying to say that you need intense local engagement to produce a basket of solutions that can learn from each other and that can provide a global advisory to people who want to support local action and make that into a partnership rather than a top down process. The second thing we're saying is that we need new knowledge, new paradigms, new systems rather than these sort of pre-colonial planning instruments, normative standards of construction that keep escalating and making more and more things of what people do wrong. So how do we change that? And we want to look at ways by which uh, we all network with each other to produce knowledge in the public domain because climate change requires everybody to make choices. And those choices have to be made on new knowledge, on new navigating of consequences, of understanding the non choices, and to understand more than anything else something that we are grappling right now that everybody is pulling back on climate change. And that's frightening. So I'll stop there and look forward to your questions and thank you for your patience as I went through these slides. So back to you, Binti.